What's up, brothers? I chose to do my presentation as animation because I wanted to get into the field. This animation was in no way easy. I had to animate about 20 frames a day, and sometimes I'd pull over 100 a day when I slacked off. Editing was even the worst part because I had to make sure all my voice parts fit. I had to make sure I had to clip a bunch of parts down as well. It was overall just a really hard experience. I'd do it again, but it'd be very hard. Successes were, I figured out a quick way to, if I did it in bits and pieces, then I could do it a lot faster. But it was still super challenging. I had to write all that stuff. I had to come up with a script too, which wasn't that hard, but then I had to fit my voice to it. I already said that. Another thing is I had to pay $40 just to use the animation software on my laptop. How I got all my information was I got some books from the DHS library. My two books I got from the DHS library, then most of my other sources I got online and the Richard Bland College website. Or government websites, which were really good for the bombings and stuff. Alright, now to what you've all been waiting for, the animation. To begin, Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a necessary event that needed to happen for the prosperity of the United States of America. The tensions between Japan and America had never been at an all-time high like this before, and eventually they would explode. All of these events happened in December of 1941, more specifically right around the 7th. On this day, Japan decided to attack the U.S. naval base of Hawaii. In response to this, the United States, Japan, and Great Britain would all come together to sign a contract that would limit their respective militaries. But little did anyone know, Japan would not follow through on the words that it had signed itself to, and eventually it would actually go back on these words, thus breaking its own contract. And then it began. Japan would begin growing its military vaster and vaster. And in 1924, as a response to this, the U.S. outlawed Japanese immigration. In response to this, Japan would take Manchuria from China, and then in response to that, the U.S. would begin building its troops, so Japan would not look as much a threat to it. Thanks to all of these events combined, these would all lead to the tragic day of Pearl Harbor. During this time in Japan, one new man came into power. His name was Hideki Tojo. A lot of people consider him the main reason for what happened on December 7th, 1941, since he was the one who began plotting it out. His original idea was just to bomb the island a couple of times. Next, around 3:14 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, two missionaries spotted a periscope out in the water. And what's the first thing a military person does when they see something they don't know? Exactly, they shoot at it. They fired one shot and missed narrowly to the left, but the second shot was right on the money. This one singular shot will be what sunk that submarine. Next up, around 6 a.m., Japanese planes had once made it over the island. Once they did, they instantly started dropping bombs and other weapons and raining hellfire down below with machine guns upon the island residents and whoever was in its way. Around 7:40 a.m., the planes had finally made it past the Oahu border, threatening everybody below. Unfortunately for all the residents, around 7:42 a.m., a watchtower guard sent out the spine-chilling message of Air Raid, Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. Now, for a weird reason, the U.S. had a fetish of naming its ships after the U.S. states. One of them, for instance, the Oklahoma, and another one, the Arizona, and et al. During this intense battle, the Oklahoma was actually bombed, thus being sunk down to the bottom of the ocean floor. As it would turn out, over half of all the deaths of Pearl Harbor would come from one ship, and this actually numbered to about 1,177 lives. All these lives came from the USS Arizona. A list of the other ships that would get damaged during this fray was the West Virginia, the Tennessee, the California, the Nevada, and the Maryland. Around 8:45 a.m., the Japanese planes set their sight on a new ship, called the Pennsylvania. Now, the Pennsylvania was so strategically placed and so out of sight that it actually had the chance to take down one whole plane on its own. Now, for some bizarre reason during this time, the president, FDR, thought it would be a good idea to use Pearl Harbor to build war support over in Germany. After this tragic event in history, 2,390 American lives were lost, while 1,178 or more were injured. The list of ships that got destroyed during the fray were the Arizona, Oklahoma, and the Utah. In addition to that, 162 planes were down too. Now, on this tragic day in history, a lot of things happened to a lot of different people. Let's take some time to acknowledge those people and their first-hand perspectives of exactly what happened on this day that burned like hell in everyone's mind. One heroic man named Joe George actually saved an entire group of people who had just fallen off of a boat. He did so by throwing a rope out into the water for all of them to grasp onto one by one. This heroic act of bravery allowed each and every one of these men to see their family once again. Another man named Cecil W. Camp was inside of the control room of the USS Utah, one of the US's battleships, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a random missile came out of the blue and hit him right where he wasn't expecting it. Now, it's time for the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just two of many cities that were inside of Japan. They were both located on the quote-unquote foot of the sock. Unfortunately, though, for them, they were part of the grand scheme of the U.S.'s to get Japan to surrender out of World War II. What the United States was hoping would happen was that by nuclear means, they could finally put the nail in the coffin and get Japan out of this war. The first of these devastating and harrowing weapons was named Little Boy, and the second one was named Fat Man. To start off, let's talk about Little Boy for a minute. The thing about Little Boy is it was dropped 600 meters above the city, or approximately 1,968 feet for all you Americans out there. Now, there was only one problem with the name Little Boy. Is the thing about this name, it was actually quite misleading, since the bomb's width was actually 3 meters, or close to 9 feet. And talking about its weight, it actually weighed close to 5 tons, which is a ton of weight. Now, the second atomic weapon, named Fat Man, this name was much more true about it, since this bomb was equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. And now, it's time for a little bit of a science lesson. The term hypocenter refers to exactly where the bomb landed on the Earth. Anyone within a 500-meter radius, or exactly 1,640 feet for all the Americans again, will be dead by the year 1945. Now, since both of these were nuclear weapons, the death toll had to have been high for each of them. For example, for Hiroshima, the death toll was around 350,000, but Nagasaki only had 250,000, which lower is still very tragic. The mind-blowing thing is that the second the bomb would hit the ground anywhere, everything around it would be turned to rubble and then to ash by the raging inferno that followed. Now, it'd only be right to question how one person could conjure this much power. The secret to that lies behind the splitting of the atom, which when this happened, a large burst of energy would be released which would result in the following explosion. Now, the second everybody found out about this new type of weapon, they instantly knew that this would be the key to winning the war, thus making them the most overpowered during it. Now, the idea for these nuclear weapons actually came from a man everybody knows well and loves, Albert Einstein, in October of 1939. Thanks to this little tip from Mr. Einstein, the US would go on to create the Manhattan Project, which was a project to create more nuclear weapons. They actually had a ton of people working on this project, but there was only one flaw in this. Nobody knew what they were doing. The US had to keep what they were doing a secret, even to the people working on it. There was only one more challenge left to face: what to do with the bomb. One ethical dilemma was whether to drop it or not, since this would result in the death of many people. At the end of the day, one can only imagine what would have happened if at the time, Germany, more specifically Adolf Hitler, had gotten a hold of this kind of atomic weapon. One could only imagine the raging hellfire he would have turned the world into. It turns out that at the time, Germany had actually been trying to construct its own nuclear weapon, but it was failed and turned into a scrapped project. Before dropping this bomb, one must consider the repercussions of it. Here were just a few of many. One man named Tosu. Now, Tosu was actually out on the front lines fighting in the war when the bomb was dropped. Due to this, he never ever got to learn what happened to his dear sister. During this time, high school students were made to pick up trash off of the streets, which would only leave them more vulnerable to a bomb if it were to be dropped at that time. Another girl named Emiko was only 8 when this bomb actually hit. Due to this, she lost her entire family, which one could only imagine what kind of trauma it would leave on an 8-year-old like that. Then the other girl named Raiko was only 9 when the bomb struck. And during this time, there was actually already an air raid alert going off. But right after this alert, she went to studying. And that is when the bomb dropped. Another person who was majorly affected by these bombs was a man named Hirano. Now, before the bombs landed, all he did all day was fish for things such as fish, shells, or crabs. But after these bombs hit, the skill would become valuable towards his survival. On August 6, 1945, where the company he worked at was meant to be demolishing somewhere around 9 o'clock. Luckily for him, though, he had a school meeting in the auditorium at 8:15 that morning. Something Hirano said himself was 8:15 a.m. was our meeting time. Suddenly, a strong orangey flash, much lighter than the summer sunshine, hit with a burst. We were not able to avoid it because we had no shade in the schoolyard, so we were directly burned. Well, I didn't feel burned at the moment because I didn't feel anything. Then the blast came. It blew us over. Everything became muddled and chaotic. Darkness surrounded us for a moment. I was thirsty and it was hard to breathe because there was too much dust. My classmates screamed, "It hurts!" or "Mother!" One of them was looking for his hat and shouted, "My hat is missing!" Anyway, everyone ran around in confusion. After the explosion, Hirano looked over at his friends. All he saw was a bunch of people with burns, shredded clothes, and overall he described them as quote-unquote monsters. Hirano survived this blast with a couple major burns on his body, but overall he was still okay. Thanks to these wounds, a new kind of discrimination appeared. It was basically a survivor discrimination, where people would avoid them because they thought what their wounds were. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were extremely tragic events, but as stated earlier, they were necessary for the United States' prosperity. What happened on these days will never be done again, hopefully, in history's time. People should not joke about this. This was a very serious matter. People in thousands were affected by this, no matter what happened. These bombings show the world what nuclear power could look like, and since then, no more nuclear weapons have been used. Now, this event was bad, but as stated, it was necessary. It led to no more, the Cold War came after that, but it led to no more nuclear conflicts happening.